In this presentation, we will take a look at the auditing process related to payroll and human resources. As we go through this, note that from a material misstatement type standpoint, we're typically most concerned with payroll here, but of course payroll is closely linked to the process within large organizations of human resources, and human resources has many other things involved that do concern us, including laws related to payroll. Obviously, the ones that are most concerning to us are the things that affect the financial statements, and that includes the withholding of payroll taxes. But there's other things that could include the internal controls as well, including the hiring and firing process of the employees of the personnel. We'll start off talking about the human resources process. So what is the human resources process? Of course, our goal in the audit process is to understand the process, to see what the inherent risks are in the process, to see what management has put in place in terms of internal controls in order to deal with those inherent risks, and then see if we can rely on those internal controls or not, designing then our control tests and our substantive tests related to human resources specifically, or more specifically, normally related to payroll type activities, those that have an effect on the financial statements. So the human resources process begins with the putting into place solid policies related to the hiring, training, evaluation, counseling, promoting, compensating, and taking remedial action for employees. Again, these are all, of course, very important within the controls of the organization. So from that standpoint, we're concerned with many of these types of items, but obviously the compensation area is going to have a direct effect in terms of a material factor on the financial statements. So that's where we'll spend a lot of our time. The primary issue involves, of course, the payroll transactions. So the payroll transactions. Now, when we process the payroll transactions, we will be dealing with the payroll expense as well as the related liabilities, those liabilities with regards to withholdings for things like FIT, federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare, transactions. So when we think about the transactions related to payroll, human resources, primary transactions processed through payroll and human resources are, of course, the payments of the employees. That's what we're going to be primarily concerned with. Those will be directly impacting the financial statements, those things that we, of course, are giving an opinion on. Accrual and payment of payroll-related liabilities, such as Social Security and unemployment taxes. This is going to be the most confusing type of thing within the payroll process, of course, when we think about whether or not it's reasonably stated. The confusing component with regards to payroll is the recording in the process of withholding payroll taxes and then paying the payroll taxes. So just in terms of like the complication of a type of transaction and the process of the transaction, payroll can be quite complicated because if you think about the journal entries involved, they're actually pretty involved journal entries, and they're going to be, you can think about the journal entries as a lump sum for payroll for all employees, and you can also break it out by the detailed checks. So payroll can be actually a quite confusing kind of factor that we look into, especially also when you're talking about different areas and different locations, as well as different kind of payroll types, compensation formats for different parts of the company and possibly different areas of the country or countries. So transaction types and accounts. So we have the payroll transactions. Payroll transactions can include, of course, cash. It could include inventory. For example, we might be paying somebody in a production type process and therefore their payroll being part of the cost of the inventory. We could have direct and indirect labor expense accounts. So when we think about direct labor and indirect labor, those usually are relating to types of industries that are making inventory. So if we're in a service company, we probably may not have the direct or indirect. Even if we're in a merchandising, buying and selling inventory, may not have direct or indirect as big of a factor. However, if we're making the inventory, then we might have direct and indirect inventory that we have to consider how to apply those out to direct or indirect payroll, that we would have to consider how to apply them into the basic cost of the inventory. And then we can have other related liabilities and expense accounts. And then on the accrued payroll liabilities transactions, we could be considering or involving cash, and then other accruals such as payroll taxes and pension costs within the accrual process for payroll. Documentation, the documents that will be involved within payroll, and of course there's going to be a lot of them because payroll is one of those things that are growing in terms of types of regulations of what needs to be included within the payroll process. So the documentation within the payroll process We have employee records, including wage rate or salary. We have the W-4 form and other document authorization forms. You'll recall that the W-4 form is the form that they're going to fill out typically when they're first hired. So that's what the employee's going to provide that information that we need, or the employer needs, in order to get everything set up, including what's their social security number and where's their address, where they located, as well as withholding type of information to see so the company can then calculate how much should be withheld. So this is a very important document for the setting up and processing of the employee in terms of the wages they will receive and the payroll taxes that will be taken from them. And then we have the timesheets. So timesheets, documentation, payroll checked or direct deposit. Obviously, this is going to be an important type of documentation. You'll recall on the payroll checks that we have to actually record out on the payroll checks the information that has been withheld. So within the payroll checks, we can't just give a check. Even if it's a direct deposit, we need to give in some format what the gross pay was, what the withholdings were, what the net pay that was actually received was in some format to the employees. And that can give us information as the auditor as well. Payroll register, so we want to make sure we have the overall payroll register. Payroll master file, the payroll master file changes reports when there's any changes to it. The periodic payroll reports, so any kind of the periodic type of reporting that we're going to need, other tax reports and forms. So note that the payroll tax forms are going to typically be done at least quarterly. We'll have quarterly 941 type forms that kind of summarize that information up. We'll have the yearly 940 form. Those are going to be types of payroll forms that we can use. And then, of course, we'll have the year-end type forms, which will be the W-2s and the W-3. Primary functions, human resources. The human resources function is the authorization of hiring, firing, wage rate, and salary changes, salaries, and payroll deductions. So that's basically the human resources process. Supervision, so the function of supervision. Review and approval of employees' attendance and time, monitoring of employee scheduling, productivity, and payroll cost changes. Then we have the timekeeping function, processing of employees' attendance and time coding of account distributions. And of course, as we think of these functions, when we're thinking of the auditing process, our goal is to think of these functions, think of what weaknesses could be involved in them, and then what controls has the company put in place to possibly account for those weaknesses or compensate for those weaknesses, and then how can we as the auditor test those controls to see if they are in place and whether they're functioning, and how can we do substantive tests with relation to these functions as well. So as we go through the documentation and the functions, we're basically keeping our whole process in mind here, and that is that we're going to be testing internal controls on these functions, on these forms, seeing how they're going to be put in place and used, and then see how much substantive testing we need to do in order to give an opinion on the payroll process. Payroll processing, computation of gross pay, deductions, and net pay, recording summarization of payments, and verification of account distribution. Then we have the disbursements function, payment of employees, compensation, and benefits. And finally, we have the general ledger function, accumulation, classification, summarization of payroll in the general ledger. So now we want to consider the segregation of duties. And recall that this is going to be one of our major internal controls. This is the thing that whenever you think of internal controls, you want to think of basically segregation of duties, separation of duties. And the goal here is to have in the key components that could result in people more easily, say, having some kind of theft or fraud related item. We want to have two people involved or some kind of separation so that can only take place if there was some type of colluding with the individuals involved. So we're going to have over here the functions, and then we're going to have the departments involved in them, operating, supporting human resources, timekeeping, payroll, IT, and the treasurer. So the initiation of wage and salary, that's going to be by operating and supporting. Then we have the initiation of employee hiring and firing. That's also going to be involving the operating and supporting activities. We have the approval of wage or salary adjustments. So the approval of the adjustments then done separately here, human resources. Then we have the updating of personal records, also human resources. Updating of payroll records, also human resources. Approval of time and job classification, so the approval process done by the operating and supporting. Review of time data and payroll distribution, that done by timekeeping. Then we have the preparation of payroll records. That's going to be done by the payroll process, as well as supporting by the IT if necessary to process the payroll. Typically, it will be in some format. Preparation and signing of payroll checks. That's going to be in IT. Because it could be done in an automated, basically, process, possibly, in the signing of the checks in a large organization, especially if it's a direct deposit type of situation. Distribution of payroll checks. That's going to be done separately now. Treasurer handling the payroll checks at this point. And then update general ledger for payroll activity. Updating the general ledger separate from the person that's handing or handling the checks. That's going to be the IT. And then we have the comparison of monthly department payroll expense to the budget done by the operating or supporting. And then we have the calculation of recording of payroll taxes done by payroll process. Okay, so what's the inherent risk of payroll? You'll recall as we go through the payroll, as we go through the human resources, our goal from the audit process is to think of inherent risk, to think of control risk, and then to think of what we're going to set detection risk to be, which is basically how much substantive testing we're going to do. In other words, how risky is the process just in general? What's the controls that have been put in place by management? And then what do we need to do, or how much substantive testing do we need to do in that case, given those factors? So the inherent risk, I would think of inherent risk as something like just inherently risky. It's just risky in and of itself. So if you removed the internal controls from the payroll process, how inherently risky would it be? We need to set the inherent risk, then we need to think about those internal controls on how effective they would be to catch any problems related to the inherent riskiness. Then we'll think about our substantive testing as the auditor to pick up any other kind of problems that may be in play. So inherent risk. The auditor should consider the effect of economic conditions on payroll costs, the supply of skilled workers, and the frequency of employee turnover. So once again, when considering the inherent risk, the auditor should consider the effect of economic conditions on the payroll costs, the supply of skilled workers, and the frequency of turnover. The auditor should be familiar with any existing labor contracts and the effect of regulations. So we could have, labor contracts that are currently in place. If we have unions involved in the type of organization that we're dealing with, then of course the long-term labor contracts are something that we want to have in consideration and could increase riskiness in terms of whether there's volatility in those contracts or not, and how those contracts are set up. The inherent risk of non-officers of the company is generally low. So when we're thinking about non-officers, we're going to see the inherent risk, we're going to set it as lower. Now, of course, if we take all the non-officers and add them together, it could be a material factor. But the fact is that any one individual that is a non-officer is more likely to be able to freely come and go into the organization and not be an inherent risk factor in and of themselves. But of course, the inherent risk of the officers in the company may not be low because of the ability to take advantage of their high position. So if we think about the officers, then of course the fact that they have more influence and can take advantage of the influence that they have within that position could make them more of an inherent risk within the process. So inherent risk assessment. Understand and document the payroll and human resources management process based on a reliance strategy. Then we want to plan and perform tests of controls on the payroll transactions. So we're going to understand and document the payroll process and human resources. So we want to, of course, think about how it's going to be put together, and then plan and perform the tests of controls. So then we think about those tests of controls, and then we are going to set and document the control risk for the payroll and human resource management process. Once we have, of course, the inherent risk and the control risk, then we can think about the detection risk, and that's going to be the risk that's going to be associated with how much substantive testing we are going to do.